Hey chess fans, so as I promised, I'm going to be doing game analysis from the top game of each of our Plainview Homeschool Chess Club Friday tournaments. This is the second video in the series, so hopefully you enjoyed the last one that featured EowynPHCC and Montana Drew. Well, this week we have returning EowynPHCC. She finished with the top score. She won all of her games, and there was a three-way tie for second place. They all had the same score and the same tiebreak, and so it was a little more difficult to pick which game I wanted to do because we already saw EowynPHCC last time. But of the three second place finishers, she actually only faced one of them. She faced FlamePanther9000. FlamePanther9000 beat the other two second place finishers, and so I wanted to pick this game. I also got to watch this game, and I thought there was a lot to learn from this one. And so we're going to go into this game between EowynPHCC and FlamePanther9000. Going into the game, EowynPHCC's Chess Kid rating was 1463 and FlamePanther9000 was 1437. Okay, so one of the things, I got to watch this game live. I don't always get to watch all the games, but this one was one I did get to watch live, and the first thing I noticed was they were moving incredibly quickly. Now these are quick games, and so you can't spend too much time, but you have about 15 minutes. I think the control was 15 minutes for these games. One of the sides I know still had more than 10 minutes left on the clock in the end, and the other one had almost 10 minutes. So both of them used only about 5 minutes. They almost treated this like a blitz game. And both of them made some major blunders that I think had to do with not taking the time, where they would move within 1 or 2 seconds and miss something. And so I'll try to point some of those out as we go through. But this was a very standard sort of Italian game as well. And so there's some patterns that you want to be familiar with. So let's go ahead and jump into it. We've got e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, and bishop c4. So again, this is just the standard Italian game. Then we have bishop c5, knight c3, and knight f6. So the four knights Italian. It's also symmetrical. So after this, we get our first changes. White castles, and black, instead of castling, plays d6. Now this move d6 kind of telegraphs that black is intending to put a pin on this knight, right? And so white has the choice to block right away with h3, or to go ahead and open up the bishop with c3. EowynPHCC with the white pieces chose to go ahead and open with the bishop, and black immediately plays the bishop to f3, bishop to g4, pinning the knight on f3. Okay, so at this point you can't ignore this pin. The reason is black has the chance to drop this knight down on d4. You also have to recognize that black has kind of stolen the tempo by waiting to castle. So black was the first to get this move in. So trying to replicate it with white is not going to work. The best thing to do is go ahead and push h3, and if the bishop takes the knight, then you just recapture and you've got extra development. If the bishop drops back, then maybe you can push the pawn. Maybe you can play the bishop out. There are a couple of ways you can go about kind of preventing this. I know I had one game where I pushed the pawn and my opponent sacked the knight, which it caused me a lot of problems. I don't think it's a sound sacrifice, but it definitely made me very nervous throughout the game. So anyways, instead, EowynPHCC tries to replicate the pin on the other side. And so black, FlamePanther9000 goes ahead and continues with the plan with knight to d4. And again, you can't ignore this. Black has the tempo. So if black takes the knight, that comes with check. And so knight d5 is just not going to work. So what else are the options? Well, you might say, well, what if you go ahead and take right away? Well, let's explore this. So we saw that white played knight d5. And the question is, what do you do in this position when you've got this pin on the knight? A natural looking thing might be bishop takes, but that's just going to bring the queen out, right? And even if you then play knight d5 to chase the queen's going to slide over to g6, which you might not notice right away, but it actually pins the g-pawn. And so once this knight is captured, this knight is completely hanging because you can only recapture with the queen. And so white has to move out of the pin, and then black is able to slide over and bring another attacker onto the knight. You say, okay, but I've got this fork over here, right? Well, yeah, but there's just so much stuff going on over here. It's not going to do you much good. You know, you can come in and attack, but there's just too much going on over here. If you retreat the knight with something like knight e3, you're still going to get, it's important in this case that you do bishop takes f3, so that when your knight captures, you're threatening checkmate right away. Okay, so that's not going to work. Capturing the knight with the bishop's not going to work. While white is not in great shape, one of the neat ideas is trying to lay a trap with b4. Okay, you say, how does that lay a trap? That just hangs a pawn, right? Okay, the idea is to get this bishop moving out of the way, and then when you take and the knight comes in, when the queen slides over, you play knight h5, or sorry, knight h4. And so now we've offered our queen for the opponent's queen. You still have the threat of the fork. And so if the queen slides over to, say, knight h5, at this point you are, queen slide over to h5. You have some options. You can go ahead and take right away. Or you can even push this pawn, block the bishop, and so even if you lose the knight, you're going to end up gaining a rook. There's just some more options. Now, this is actually why it was important to move the bishop in the first place. It's really hard to think this far ahead. But let's back up again, just a couple moves. Okay, right here, notice the bishop is pointed at the king. So the whole point of b4 was so that when you play f3 later, black can't get a revealed check with the knight. Right? So b4 distracts the bishop away from the pin, allowing for the capture. And now all of this works. And it would not have worked as long as the bishop was sitting on c5. Now that's some high-level stuff. Not expecting y'all to spot things like that often. And so this is it's a little better for white in this position. It's not that much better because, like I said, you're probably going to lose a couple of knights for a pawn and a rook, but at least it gets you out. Obviously, black can avoid this whole thing by just scooting back the bishop to b6, and black has still got the advantage. Okay, but instead, white plays knight to d5. Like I said, this is not going to work because black is able to just jump in right away, capture the knight with check, and after the recapture, the bishop slides over to h3, So that again gains a tempo because now the rook has to move, right? Okay, so all right, so let's see. The next comes black plays h6. This is not a bad move, but if I'm white, I'm thinking my king is on this open file. If I could move my bishop like a rook, I would put it back, but I can't. It's going to take me 2 moves. So h6 just feels like it was a free move. Now, interestingly, white goes ahead with the knight capture first with check, forcing black to also open up their own diagonal. So again, this is looking very symmetrical. The only difference is the pawn and bishop placements. All right. So right here, black makes their first big mistake, and they'll get some chances to recover, but this was a big mistake right here. Castling kingside puts the king on the open file, all right? And basically shifts the tempo back to white. White could slide his king over and bring the rook in pretty quickly. It also takes away a rook from the attack. Right, the rook could have slid over and started an attack pretty well, even with something like, all right, let's say if we got here, let's say white doesn't block with the bishop, okay, which would be the correct move, but let's say white slides over. Well, that's just almost automatically losing because we've got bishop, check, king has to slide back, and then revealed check, and the queen's gonna fall in the next move. So after king over, goodbye queen. So really, at that point, castling was not the best idea. King up to d7 or king to e7 would work because it would allow the other pieces, the other rook and queen, to get in. More likely king to, I don't know, it depends on where that bishop's going to end up. So instead, black castles, the bishop blocks the file. In this case, because the king is sitting on the open file, it's probably better to go ahead and move your king over and try to do the reverse threat and bring the rook back over and check. But instead, white blocks the file with bishop g3. Okay. So the king moves to protect this pawn, make sure that it's not going to be hanging, because you see things like the potential of queen d2 with an attack coming in. And then white plays f4. This is good. This this solves the problem with the queen getting into the game. It allows the queen access to the h5 square. Black, however, doesn't really have to do anything about that, but could continue to play symmetrically and push f5 and open up their own queen. Or just leave that pawn there and scoot the queen forward. The thing is if white ever plays capture, that just fixes black's pawn structure and the queen comes in. So that's one of the reasons why it would be almost important to play f5 to kind of force the capture, which could then be recaptured and the queen's got the open diagonal, right? So instead, black captures and gets tripled pawns. Generally, you don't want tripled pawns in a game. This doesn't really help black any. White does obviously capture the pawn in the exchange right away, giving white more eyes on this pawn with the threat of the queen coming in very soon. So black starts by trying to claim some tempo with the rook move, and white scoots the bishop back, which is probably fine. I said you don't want to end up with your king sliding over and then getting this whole revealed check sort of thing. So the right move there is definitely bishop g3. The queen slides up. And the d4 push is good. One of the things that it does is it creates space for this bishop. Because if you can get the bishop or the queen on here, then you could eventually push that pawn with a revealed check. And that would be really strong. Especially if you pulled that off and got the 2 pawns in front of it out of the way first. I can see a situation where you have a... maybe the bishop slides back. Let's just pretend we got something like this going on. Oh, you don't want to do that yet. Yeah. But anyway, so there's some ideas with some revealed checks if you can get the bishop over onto the d3 square. Anyway, so the bishop drops back, and the pawn comes up to thwart, which is fine. Here is the chance to go ahead and open up this long diagonal with the king by capturing with the pawn, but instead white captures with the bishop. It's not awful, it's just it would have been a little bit better to capture with the e5 pawn, because you see if you capture with the e5 pawn, you got the open file for the rook, and you've got the open diagonal to the king. So that's why it would have been a little bit better to capture with the e-pawn. And then black plays this really sneaky move f5. Okay, now when you're looking at this in the game, it kind of looks like, okay, this f5 pawn is protected by the bishop, it's protected by the queen. So if I capture it, it's just going to bring in more pieces, attack, maybe the queen will come in and attack my bishop. So I don't really want to do that, but I don't want my bishop to be undermined with, pawn captures. But the threat is not for the pawn to capture e4. We can't forget, this bishop is pinned. And if this pawn pushes, that bishop's lost. And that's something EowynPHCC misses and plays bishop to c4, and FlamePanther9000 correctly pushes the pawn, attacking the pinned bishop. That bishop is now going to be lost. Okay, so we have the bishop come back. Now the bishop's on the right diagonal. Okay, now the bishop's where it needs to be. But a little bit too late because the pawn captures. Now the play was f takes g3. It might have been a little bit better to play the intermezzo, the in-between move, e5 check. Okay. Now black has to do something about this check, depending on what they do would also affect which pawn ends up capturing here. Instead, we've got the pawn captures on h3. If you're going to capture right here, it would probably be better to capture with h3 pawn to give your king a place to come over and help defend the h3 square and eventually maybe take that bishop if the queen ever gets blocked or moved. So instead we have f takes g3, and then we have c5. We have just some moves in attempting to they're just kind of battling back and forth, trying to outplay each other. These are all decent moves. This is really strong coming in with putting the pressure on this pawn. However, black makes a huge mistake here, and white does not grasp the full amount of this mistake. Black plays f5. Okay. Now, whenever somebody plays a pawn move like this, pushes the pawn 2 squares, leaves it right next to one of yours, you have to look at en passant. You have to. You have to think, what does en passant do? Okay. Now, I know what was being thought was, hey, the bishop's now free. If I take en passant, the bishop's not free anymore. But if you take en passant, then this bishop, your own bishop, still has eyes on the h7 square. So if you capture the h6 pawn and they try to block with the queen, you win the queen with checkmate, right? So in this case, en passant is by far the best move. There's just nothing that black can do against it. Instead, not recognizing how strong it was having that pawn on f6, blocking king from going to g7, EowynPHCC goes ahead and captures the bishop, which is fine. It's still up several pawns at this position. Things are looking pretty solid. And the check comes here. We get some trades, which is definitely good for white because white grabs some more pawns in the process. There was with this capture, notice that this is a fork. And so, and also the threat. Now there's two attackers on this pawn, which could cost the rook. So right here, black steps back and threatens the rook. And within 2 seconds, EowynPHCC takes the free pawn and drops the rook. And that was another huge swing in the game. Grabbing that pawn without taking the time, there was no time pressure here. There was no reason to move this fast. Once you get to this point in the game where you're pretty much in the end game, especially when you're ahead, you have to take it a little slower. Recognize my opponent has a dark squared bishop, so I need all of my pieces on light squares. You get all your pieces on light squares, then it's basically you're up a piece. Instead, we drop the rook. Okay, so there was still an opportunity for pretty much a forced draw, which probably would have been in EowynPHCC's best interest at this point. Okay, notice we've got the bishop sitting here pointed at the square. Okay, rook h7 forces king to g5. Now keep in mind that the king is now blocked in pretty strongly. You can't go here because of the bishop. Can't go here because of the pawn. Now the bishop is not protected, and so the rook coming over, there's a huge threat coming up. Let's say, I'm trying to think of what just a random move might be that black might take. Let's say black just pushes a pawn, okay? Then you've got this threat, check. There's only one legal move, followed by checkmate, right? And so the only good way to stop that is king back to h6, followed by rook h7, king g5, rook f7, king h6, rook h7, and it's a draw. So there was a chance for a forced draw there, and if black didn't take the draw, you're looking at checkmate. So instead, let's back up. White takes the a7 pawn and missed that opportunity. Black offers an exchange here. White instead steps back. Moving to here might have been a little stronger, but that's kind of scary because that means you're throwing away your last really strong piece. And generally, when it's 2 rooks versus 1 rook, the best thing black can do is to trade off trade rooks. So probably wisely, not seeing if it was going to be sound enough, white steps the rook back, and also lines up kind of this revealed attack on the king. So black steps down to attack the bishop. The bishop retreats. Probably a little stronger would have been just to slide the pawn up. That would have made this whole chain really hard to break down. The bishop comes back, the rook comes over. We get a nice little revealed check. The king steps down. And before, when we had the rook on this file, we actually had 2 attackers on the G3 pawn, so we couldn't move the H pawn. Now that the rook is off of that file, we can move H4 check. All right, so after king to G4, we have check. And again, it looks like we could have a forced draw because the king steps back. And the idea is the forced draw comes with king to F3, which prevents rook to E3, right? And you're threatening something like pawn to G4. So let's kind of take a look at what might happen here. So obviously, black can't check with either rook, right? Clearly, if black checks with this rook, the rook is lost. If black checks with this rook, the rook is lost. Right? So more than likely, the best thing for black is to just capture the pawn, after which you get G4. And if black captures, then white can check. Black has to come back, and then we just end up repeating. Now, why does this not work? Well, because that blunders mate in 1. The pawn is protecting that square. So there was another chance for forced draw right here if white steps to F3. Instead, white steps to H3, going for the kill. Black should have seen that G4 would be mate and played rook to E3. However, without being under time pressure, black snags the pawn. EowynPHCC wins the game. Okay, so the big takeaway lesson from this: use your clock. Both of these kids played really spectacular moves, and both of them lost very major advantages to moves that were made way too fast because they felt comfortable. Okay, so that was the big thing. Now, also, the other main thing I would say to watch out for is, particularly when you're playing in these Italian games, always watch out for this position where the knight can come in, right, and put double pressure on this knight. You don't want that happening. You always have to protect against that in the Italian games. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself like EowynPHCC did, with a whole bunch of pressure on the king side, the castle being busted open. I've seen her lose some games in situations like that before, so she did a little bit better here. Trying the let's counterattack by doing the same attack to you. Not the best idea, but she still managed to survive the attack and even get into a better late middle game. So again, these kids are doing really good. They're playing great chess. You take away, I think both of them had just two major mistakes. If you take even one of those away, then the game was an easy victory for the other one. So doing great job with these games. They're exciting to watch. They're fun to watch. Keep practicing. Keep doing those chess puzzles. They'll help you see these a little faster. But the main thing is take your time. If you have a lot of time, don't be in too much of a hurry, especially if you have that advantage. So good job, kids. Look forward to seeing some more games and more exciting situations like we saw in this one in the next tournament. So I'll see you guys later.